feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you yet again, if you wish to contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way, as always, to get your opinions out there on air. You can do the same through our website as well, gsmcpodcast.net. You can either leave a tip or donation or any questions, comments, or concerns you have about the show. Just makes it that much better and really gets you all involved as well. But without further ado, let us get into our second segment, continuing the theme of ranking the best players at each position in this 2024 fantasy football season with the running back position. And what a revolution we saw at the position this season. Kind of running back renaissance. A lot of these older players finding new homes and revitalizing their careers, potentially younger guys getting a new opportunity or a renewed opportunity to really make a name for themselves in their respective offenses. So you kind of see that balance in these ranking of this top four, but ultimately two guys that made the most noise you are already all too familiar with seeing at the top of these kinds of rankings, but the two guys at the bottom could define this next generation of running backs as just as much as these two guys had defined theirs. So without further ado, let us talk about them, starting off with the number 4 guy here, Bijan Robinson. A lot of talk about what his season could look like with new head coach Raheem Morris. A lot of talk from Raheem Morris in terms of Bijan being able to get the ball more, using him a lot more in certain situations, and he turned it into a pretty decent season. However, when I was watching the Falcons this season, it just seemed that Bijan Robinson, for the most part, seemed to have a disconnect between himself and the offensive line. It definitely plays into his style of play, potentially being part of the problem in that he just waits to make that one cut up field to try and gain that advantage in terms of his north to south running style, but ultimately it hasn't really worked as well as I thought it would with this offensive line, and it could be kind of a detriment to the future of him in this offense, but ultimately it's because of his skill set alone, because of his ability to also receive out of the backfield alone, that just makes him such a high upside player, and the reason why he's paying dividends for a lot of fantasy football owners this season. 15.7 point average, 251.54 total fantasy points this season for Bijan Robinson. So hopefully he continues to grow into this new look offense. Ultimately, if Michael Penix is going to be the QB of the future for Atlanta, look for him to heavily rely upon Bijan Robinson to truly complement what he can do. As we've seen over these past couple of weeks, he definitely finished with a bang, Bijan, in that game against Carolina yesterday, really carrying the load. So maybe that could be a harbinger of things to come for this Atlanta Falcons offense. And if so, I'm excited to see what it brings. So congratulations to Bijan Robinson. Even in a situation and system where I don't necessarily see the fit as much as other people, I still believe that he's going to be a truly fascinating fantasy player to follow for the next decade or so as he grows with this Atlanta Falcons offense. But congratulations to him for being the number 4 player. The number 3 player is even more interesting because this guy was in a 2 running back system until his partner went down with injury just a couple of weeks ago. That will see him be the RB1 heading into the postseason for the Detroit Lions. Yes, Jahmyr Gibbs is the number 3 running back this season, and his performance last night against Minnesota to clinch the number 1 seed in the NFC was heavy proof of why. Jahmyr Gibbs is one of those guys that, yes, has to kind of compete with David Montgomery for touches in the system. But I do believe that he's the more explosive back of the two when he gets into the open field, whether it be running out of the backfield or an outside zone runs, or receiving the football out of the backfield, kind of adding a nice complementary piece to the passing game for Jared Goff there as well. 16.9 fantasy points per game average, 269.9 total fantasy points this season. Ultimately, you had to add in his almost 50-point performance last night, I was kind of sweating it out in my 5th place game in my own fantasy league for the way Jahmyr Gibbs performed in fantasy last night. So we're going to have to add that big total to his numbers as well this season. And it could see him potentially surpass Derrick Henry, even though Derrick Henry had a pretty nice game himself in this last week. And we'll talk about him a little later in the segment. But ultimately, what I love about Jahmyr Gibbs is that this season saw him step up in a huge way for this Lions offense. I was really thinking that this Lions offense was kind of seeing a transition from this very balanced attack to one in which Jared Goff was comfortable carrying the load as a passer. And at certain points, he certainly was. Hyper efficient against blitzes, hyper efficient against pressures, finding so many different ways along with offensive coordinator Ben Johnson to dissect opposing defense, especially in that very tough and physical NFC North. But ultimately, the reason why this Detroit Lions team could be the presumptive favorite to go to the Super Bowl for the first time in their history is because of the running attack and how Ben Johnson really implemented it to perfection this season. Yes, I'm kind of interested to see how he looks sans Dave Montgomery, as he's going to get a much bigger load, much bigger usage rate come postseason time. But I do feel like Jahmyr Gibbs is one of those players and one of those running backs that I really am excited to see grow in this Lions offense and throughout his NFL career. He's going to be someone who I heavily monitor throughout his career, both in real life and fantasy, just because of what he brings to the table for Detroit as a true contender for as long as he stays there. So ultimately, congratulations to Jahmyr Gibbs for finishing his RB3 this season in the 2024 fantasy football season. Now let's talk about the two guys that dominated the headlines at the running back position, really creating and coining the term running back renaissance, finding new homes even as they're getting up there in age, or no matter how you see it, entering their primes perhaps with these new teams. Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry. Let's start with the RB2 of this season, Derrick Henry. 18.1 fantasy points per game average, 289.5 or 284.5 fantasy points overall for Derrick Henry, plus that tremendous game he had in the last week of the season. But ultimately, Derrick Henry was someone who I was completely wrong about this season. I truly thought that he was going to struggle this season against this very physical AFC North group of defenses and really wouldn't transition very well to the style of offense the Ravens wanted to play. Because I really thought that by having two guys in J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards, that they would add a nice dynamic in the backfield to counterbalance whatever Lamar Jackson did. And it just created a lot of pace, a lot of speed in this offensive scheme for Baltimore that not a lot of teams could end up stopping. But bringing in a guy like Derrick Henry gave me pause because of the fact that he would slow a lot of things down. Boy, was I wrong. He really was someone who stepped up to the plate for this Baltimore Ravens offense in more ways than one, just because of his physical style of play. They could really run him out there in any situation and know that his physicality would wear down opposing defenses, thus lining up boxes, thus allowing Lamar to get going in both the design run and passing game, and ultimately cementing himself as still one of the running backs to watch for as long as he's in the NFL for these next couple of years. Because of the fact that his style of running you can't necessarily teach defending, because he can just run over you, he can just wear you down, wear you out, and ultimately win football games on his own, no matter the situation. And that's what he showed this season, that no matter what your style of running is, you can be dynamic as you get up there in age as a running back still. And I'm really excited to see how long his tenure in Baltimore is and how long he can stay this premier running back who can define his generation for years to come. But unfortunately, he was just not as good as this young man in Philly, staying in the NFC East, betraying that New York Giants fan base. And I know how much heartbreak they're going through as someone who lives in the tri-state area because of this whole situation with him. But Saquon Barkley certainly enjoying life in Philly just as much as he did in New York, even though that was a pretty tenuous relationship there with all the injuries he went through and how the organization viewed him. So it's good to see Saquon in a nice, healthy place, having a full season of play, nearly breaking Eric Dickerson's single-season rushing record. Unfortunately, Nick Sirianni is deciding to rest him for the postseason. But I truly believe that Saquon Barkley has become the definitive RB1 in this running back renaissance. He's leading the surge as being this guy who comes into Philly, really stakes his claim as the best player on this offense, and this really talented offense at that, with Jalen Hurts, this potent offensive line, A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith as one of the best wide receiver tandems in all of football, and really saying, hey, I'm going to be the focal point of this offense. I'm going to lead us to new horizons, and I'm really going to complement what you want to do super well in this offense. And ultimately, he did just that, to the point where he nearly broke the single-season rushing record. And yes, there would be speculation of whether or not it would be a legitimate record because Eric Dickerson took shorter. I think it would have been had he set the record, but ultimately, the record's not what matters. What matters is this kind of definitive statement to the rest of the NFL that Saquon is still someone who's a force in the league that you have to look out for and you have to account for. 20.1 fantasy points per game average, 322.3 fantasy points, so still a lot more than Derrick Henry, as you see, thus cementing himself as the outright RB1. Unfortunately, potentially not enough to really boost his MVP candidacy in terms of going up against guys like Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson, the QB position. Had he potentially have gotten that record in a nice looking fashion, then maybe he would have a better case, but ultimately he wouldn't have been beating them anyways. But still, a tremendous running back season for Saquon Barkley, truly showing that this running back position is deeper than a lot of people think. You just have to dig deep and find different guys who you feel can break out or still retain their potency as they get up in age there, reaching their peaks, like Saquon and Derrick Henry, with new teams, ultimately a new reference point for how to view the running back position for years to come. But let me know what you think in the comments about the running back position this season. It's going to be one of the most important running back positions for years to come, but ultimately, once we come back from break, we're going to be talking about a position group that's kind of regressing just a little bit to the mean here. The wide receiver position, not too many guys looking that elite this year, but ultimately still a very deep position group. We'll be right back after the break to talk about it as well.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to